Hi. So this will take 5,000 of this. I don't know. I can't seem to get this out without making some sort of mistake at some point. And I'm too lazy to actually go through and edit the video. So yeah, not going to say too much more. Uh, this is going to be me reading an excerpt from the book that I'm supposedly working on. Um, it's towards the beginning of the book. Pretty much the only thing you need to know is that Darian, the main character, has a talking sword named Knight. Um, and I go into why he has a talking sword further into the book, but you're just going to have to accept the fact that there's a talking sword in this book and that you're not going to get to know why for, well, however long it takes me to actually get this finished or published or whatever. Okay. After several hours along the road, Darian noticed a shadow ahead, directly in his path. Its curves and sharp points looked alien beside the bare earth and shadows of hunched trees. As Darian drew nearer, he began to notice chunks of blackened metal sticking out of the earth around the road. They rose like monuments or gravestones. A shiver welled up from deep in his chest as he passed them. The shadow turned out to be the cracked and crumpled shape of a ship that had crashed onto the road. Long ago, people had torn the hull apart for scrap, so that only a great curving skeleton, shimmering like the sword at Darian's hip, remained. Darian stood, a hand on one of the ship's silver bones, at the threshold looking in. Cool black shadows filled the inner spaces. For a moment Darian thought of walking around, but then he thought of Kathy. She would never have forgiven him for turning away. He stepped into the ship, feeling like a grave robber, but also with an excitement of adventure he hadn't felt in years. He walked between crumpled beams that had once been a hall, the roof now just open sky. He could almost hear the engine of that ship humming in the girders. He could almost hear the echo of feet down the corridor. He could almost look outside the ship and see stars. He noticed the sharp metal sound of his feet on the floor first. Before now he had been walking on bare earth, the floor long since stolen. The floor he walked over now was a blue metal. Next, walls began to cover the skeleton, so that Darian was truly walking down a corridor. Last came the ceiling, so that Darian walked in darkness, lit from behind by daylight. His breath rushed in and out of his chest. He couldn't hear his feet any longer over the thunder of his pulse. The hall ended at a door. Embossed dragons twined along the frame, emerald eyes glimmering even in the scant light available. What? Darian ran his fingers over the dragons and jerked his hand back with a start. He'd felt the metal humming under his fingers, as though suffused with energy. Slowly, he reached a hand for the wheel in the center of the door. Might I suggest we simply go around? Knight's voice made Darian jump. I want to see what's inside. Very well, but do so with caution. Darian reached for the wheel again and stopped, looking down at the sword. You sound as though you know what's on the other side of this door. Knight didn't say anything, and so Darian reached for the wheel and opened the door. It swung in, as silent as still night. A circular room lay on the other side, and in the center of the room, a pedestal holding nothing. Darkness filled the room, and yet, for some reason Darian couldn't pin, it didn't feel dark. He stepped forward, his hands still resting on the door, as though to keep him anchored. Something on the floor shimmered. He stepped forward again and realized why the room didn't feel dark. Blue crystal shards, just barely glowing, covered the floor. He stepped forward again, reached for one of the shards, and that's when the door swept out of his hand and thundered shut. It took a minute for his eyes to adjust to the dull glow of the shattered crystal. He spun back to the door, but it wouldn't open from the inside. On the far side of the room, he could just barely see another door. He rushed toward it, the crystal skittering under his feet. The shards hummed harmonically. The sound grew louder, the further Darian came into the room. By the time he'd reached the pedestal in the center, the humming had grown to such a volume that the room seemed to spin about him. He heard Kathy's voice in that hum, the rise and fall so like that of a story. He heard Mariala's breath, quiet and hissing, as she slept on his shoulder. He heard a woman singing, the song wordless and echoing to a sky he couldn't see. The weight of the hum, of all the disparate moments that made it up, drove Darian to his knees. He grabbed the pedestal, pulled himself back up, and ran for the door. The wheel stuck for an instant, and Darian felt panic rising up in his stomach. He'd be stuck in this room forever with all those voices. With a shriek, the wheel turned. The door opened, and Darian spilled out into daylight. He lay on the other side, breathing deeply. The door closed silently. The daylight, though brighter, seemed strangely dull. It was as though day was just a memory of the light inside the room. What was that? It would have been the heart of the ship once. Knight's voice was hushed. Like so much else, it is shattered and broken now, just a pale reflection of what it once was. You mean it would have been what? The engine? Can't you just leave well enough alone? Knight's voice snapped. It's gone now. That's all that matters. Let's go. This place holds nothing for us. Nothing. They walked in silence, the sword and the boy, through the corridors of a ship that had once flown the stars. Yet even in the silence, a quiet hum echoed in the bones. It followed them all the way to what had once been a room. Now it was only a circle of metal pillars rising toward the clouds. Dark blue grass swayed along the floor. In the center of that floor, on a bed of moss and flowers, lay a skeleton. The pitted, dirty bones looked small and fragile beside the great glimmering bones of the ship. It had long since fallen apart and no longer held the shape of a man. The skull stared up with eyes dark and wide and full of sorrow. Small flowers, purple and red, surrounded the remains. Darian knelt for a moment. He reached out, as though to touch the bones, but he didn't. He couldn't. He wondered who it had been. Had they been on the ship when it crashed? Were the bones newer, a scavenger who had died here as alone and forgotten as the ship in which he lay? Darian left the ship, dust-coated tear streaks on his face. On the top of a distant hill, just before the ship passed from view, he heard Knight's voice whisper something so quiet there was no way Darian could miss the words on the wind. Farewell, silent brother.